YouTube, it's Buddhagem, and I've been introduced to the strange world of Paleocrat, a guy who claims the theory of evolution is a farce. I'm wondering if anybody can tell me why there are no dinosaurs in the Bible. I'm not sure if he buys into the theory of gravity or not, but it's clear that he has no regard for science. What caught my eye, however, wasn't his primitive beliefs in our origins, but his diluted take on the media. One of the things Paleocrat mentioned in his video. He argues that the media is more diverse than it has ever been. But before I begin, I'd want to say a few general things about the media. First of all, the media fool all of us. Yes, even me. According to a recent article I read, the average American encounters over 16,000 different forms of advertisement daily. And the key to all of this? Nobody really believes they can be manipulated. The media, they fooled my owner into buying this stupid shirt for me. Of course, we are manipulated all the time. I know you really think that you just have a real desire for name brand designer handbags that are made in China by wage slaves, but the reality is not quite so simple. Marketing works. And once you understand that, maybe we can move on past the obvious. Yes, marketing sells us things we don't need and don't really want. But it also convinces us of other things, like unions are bad, the Democrats and Republicans really represent the political spectrum, and the United States has military bases all over the planet because we just really like to help people. We are being sold more than products. We are being sold a worldview. And if you think that this clash between conservative and liberals is real, you're not paying attention. Please understand that this is not an attack on anybody's intelligence. Again, this stuff affects us all. I'm not immune. Guys like Noam Chomsky and Michael Parenti, who have studied this issue in depth, are not immune. And it takes a real concerted effort to free ourselves from the lies we're constantly bombarded with. I'll be posting some links in the sidebar that I hope you'll take a look at, because I really think that media reform should be the top of anybody's agenda. Without a functioning media that informs us, we as citizens cannot make the important decisions that need to be made. Democracy is simply not possible without an informed and educated public. As you can probably tell, this is really not about Paleocrat at all. It's just that he seems to represent a rather stereotypical view held by many in our country. Clearly, an astute and informed citizen isn't going to come to the conclusion that the theory of evolution is a farce. He's a product of manipulation. So let's take a look at a couple of the things he says. First of all, Paleocrat argues against the idea that there is a media monopoly. He says the media is more diverse than it has ever been. He points to things like YouTube and the great diversity of magazines at Barnes & Noble. But is it true? When I was a kid, I had access to a handful of television stations. Now with cable and satellite, I have access to hundreds of stations. There are thousands of new books published every year, and not only do we have the traditional radio broadcasts, we also have access to satellite radio. But does more really mean more diversity? No. When Paleocrat goes to Barnes & Noble, he may be awed at the wide array of books. I'm not. In fact, I'm usually quite disappointed in the fact that there are seldom, if any, books on anarchism, communism, Marxism. I've been to Barnes & Nobles all over the country, and I've yet to find one that has ever carried any labor history books. What I do see are usually books that follow along party lines. There are those arguing what a bad guy Bush is, and there are those arguing what a great President Bush is, but not much else. Occasionally, I'll find a Barnes & Noble that actually has some small selection of Noam Chomsky. I've never seen Naomi Klein, Arundhati Roy, Michael Parenti, or William Blum, just to name a few. What I'm arguing is that although there is much more media to consume in this country, most of it is of a very homogeneous content. To simplify it, and to borrow a few phrases from Michael Parenti, what we essentially have at a Barnes & Noble are books that offer, on the one hand, a liberal complaint, and on the other, a conservative celebration. What's typically missing, what I always find missing, are books that offer a radical class analysis. Let me get away from my own anecdotal evidence. Over at the Lying Media Bastards, I came across a rather interesting study conducted at Sonoma State University. They did a network analysis of the board of directors for the 10 big media giants. The team determined that only 118 people comprised the membership on the boards of directors of the 10 big media giants. This is a small enough group to fit in a moderately sized university classroom. These 118 individuals in turn sit on the corporate boards of 288 national and international corporations. In fact, 8 out of 10 big media giants share common membership on board of directors with each other. NBC and Washington Post both have board members who sit on Coca-Cola and J.P. Morgan, while the Tribune Company, the New York Times, and Gannett all have members who share a seat on Pepsi. It's kind of like one big happy family of interlocks and shared interests. That's 118 people having control over what you and I see and hear. How diverse a group do you think those 118 people represent? Think there are many anarchists in that group? How many Marxists? How many people in that group do you think belong to a labor union? To get an idea of just how concentrated the media really is, consider the following taken from the Media Reform Information Center. In 1983, 50 corporations controlled the vast majority of all news media in the U.S. At that time, Ben Badakian was called alarmist for pointing this out in his book, The Media Monopoly. In his 4th edition, published in 1992, he wrote, "In the U.S., fewer than 24 of these extreme creatures own and operate 90% of the mass media, controlling almost all of America's newspapers, magazines, TV and radio stations, books, records, movies, videos, wire services, and photo agencies." He predicted then that eventually this number would fall to about a half dozen companies. This was greeted with skepticism at the time. When the 6th edition of the Media Monopoly was published in 2000, the number had fallen to 6. Since then, there have been more mergers, and the scope has expanded to include new media, like the Internet market. More than 1 in 4 Internet users in the U.S. now log in with AOL Time Warner, the world's largest media corporation. In 2004, Badakian's revised and expanded book, The New Media Monopoly, shows that only 5 huge corporations, Time Warner, Disney, Murdoch's News Corporation, Bertelsmann of Germany, and Viacom, now control most of the media industry in the U.S. Let me just give one more example of how little diversity there is in the mainstream media. A great place to look at this issue in more depth is FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, where they do a true analysis of the news. Starting the day after the bombing in Iraq began on March 19th, the 3-week study from March 20th, 2003 to April 9th, 2003 looked at 1,617 on-camera sources appearing in stories about Iraq on the evening newscasts of 6 television networks and news channels. The news programs studied were ABC World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, CNN's Wolf Blitzer Reports, Fox's Special Report with Brit Hume, and PBS's NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. The study was conducted using Nexus database transcripts. Nearly 2/3 of all sources, 64%, were pro-war, while 71% of U.S. guests favored the war. Anti-war voices were 10% of all sources, but just 6% of non-Iraqi sources and 3% of U.S. sources. Thus, viewers are more than 6 times as likely to see a pro-war source as one who is anti-war. With U.S. guests alone, that ratio increases 25 to 1. As you let those numbers sink in, keep in mind that this was at a time when millions of Americans were taking to the streets to protest the war. There were and still are plenty of anti-war voices out there, but you will seldom hear them in the media. So much for diversity. So why do people like Paleocrat think there is so much diversity? Political analyst Michael Parenti calls this particular manipulation technique
of media manipulation is false balancing. The canons of good journalism is to tap competing sources to get both sides of an issue. In fact, both sides are seldom accorded equal prominence. One study found that even on NPR, supposedly the more liberal of the mainstream media, right-wing spokespersons, conservatives, were often interviewed alone, while liberals, on the less frequent occasions they appeared, were almost always offset by a conservative counter view. Furthermore, both sides of the story are not necessarily all sides. Left, progressive, and radical views are completely